I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. We were off for July 4th. I hope you were too. I hope you had a great holiday and read a little bit of something on your to-be-read pile. This week, we have a fascinating conversation about literature in translation, how it's done, how it's changed over the years, and why we might all want to read a little bit more of it. And then, after the break, we look back at the blockbuster book Bridget Jones's Diary, which was published 25 years ago in the United States. I'm now joined by Juliana Barbassa, who runs news and features coverage for the Book Review, and Greg Cowles, a senior editor here and our poetry editor. He's been on several times before. Greg, thanks for being on again.
Thanks for having me.
Juliana, this is your first time. Welcome.
It's a pleasure.
I hope so. Not everyone who listens to the Book Review podcast reads the Book Review in print form, which is fine. I get it. It's 2023. So they might not have seen our recent issue devoted to literature in translation. It contains about a dozen reviews, a couple of essays, and a very revealing roundtable discussion with some actual translators. So I'm going to start by asking the two of you, Greg and Juliana, maybe we'll start with Greg. Why did we even decide to do this issue?
Well, it was a confluence of a few different factors, chiefly that back in the winter, we noticed a heavier than usual concentration of very strong literature and translation coming down the pipeline. Some by younger writers being translated into English for the first time, some by established masters from other countries. And all of this was happening coincidentally at the same time that I was reading a book by a translator named Daniel Hahn called Catching Fire. And it was his diary of translating a Chilean novelist, Diamela Eltit. She is an avant-garde novelist. She wrote a novel called Never Did the Fire about an aging revolutionary couple whose son has died, and they're wondering where their life is going in the absence of their political cause, now in the absence of their dead son. Where do they go from here? And I had started reading that novel and alongside it reading this translation diary, and I just got really enthralled with this whole notion of how do you translate, especially this was like an experimental book. How do you enter into somebody else's artistic project and bring it over into another language for readers who don't read the original? And I started talking about that in the office, and Juliana and Emily Egan, another editor on the desk, were especially interested. And we talked about all these different issues of translation. And knowing that we had all of these new books in translation coming our way as well, I said, I'd love to do a theme issue sometime, pulling all of these things together. And the two of them, especially Juliana and Emily, said, let's do it. And we brainstormed what might go into that issue. And here we are.
Juliana, you, before joining the Book Review about a year and a half ago, were a longtime editor on our international desk. I know we've had many conversations about the Book Review's coverage of literary scenes from other countries. You've also, I know, have been very interested in literature and translation for a while. How did that start to bubble up?
Going back to my time covering international news as a reporter and then as an editor, I'd realized that often to understand what's really going on in a place, I know the facts, I know the news, I know what's happening, but I would often find myself turning to the fiction produced in that place to really get a sense of how these issues are playing out, what are the tension points, what are the sort of major shifts in a society. You can often read that, you can often get a feel for that in its literature. An example of that is a piece that I did not long after joining the Book Review about women writers in Latin America and how they're bringing in horror and fantasy into their work. It's a way of essentially writing about violence, writing about things that are horrific, and returning the horror to the horrific. So it tells you something about the region and what people are grappling with. So I've always been interested in reading what is coming out of other places as a way of better understanding the places as well. And of course, literature is literature. It's about the human experience. There will be great literature everywhere that you look, and why limit yourself? So there's that element. And then there's the element of language, which I've always been fascinated by. I'm fascinated by the act of literary translation. As Greg was saying, how do you enter into another's art project? How do you carry it over into another language? How do you work within the limits and possibilities of two different languages? So I was very interested in how it's done, who does it, what is the process like? So that's what brought me into a real interest in doing the special issue.
Juliana, you led a discussion between 5 translators, all of whom translate from different languages: Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese. Talk to us a little bit about that conversation and what stood out to you.
Well, I was interested in the doing of, again, and who does this and why they do it, how they do it. There are various elements that came out. One is very practical. People who work in this field are highly skilled, often rather underpaid. It's a very solitary job. There's a lot that's hard about it. So what is it that brings them to it, and what are they doing to improve conditions? There's been a lot of advocacy by translators, by organizations like PEN recently, to do things like put translators' names on the cover, to grant them copyright, things like that are going to make this a sustainable job. I was also very interested in how these changes, this greater recognition of the translator, has allowed a sense of authorship, a sense of translation as a creative art to reach the reader. Essentially, if you know who your translator is, you know what they bring to it, you know what their background is, you know what elements they might be imprinting on the translator. And it also recognizes, from the translator's perspective, that this is a creative and subjective art, and allows readers to identify with particular translators. Say if you read Daniel Hahn and you know that you loved one book that he did, you might look, much as you do with an author, you might look for other books that he has translated.
One of the things that is said several times, and it's obvious once you read it for the first time, is that if you take the same work and you give it to 2 or 3 different translators, you'd probably come up with literally 3 different translations, 3 different books. Almost. One of the things that one of the people you talked to said is that translation is an extremely creative practice, is the quote. I don't write my own work, I write translation. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I think for a lot of people, they see it as just, there's a word in Spanish and I'm going to put it in the word in English. There's a sentence in Chinese and I'm going to just translate that to English. And it's not very complicated. We're going to talk about a very cool online interactive that gets to this very purpose, but I'd love for you to just unpack that a little bit for listeners who may not really understand how much work goes into a good translation.
This is a huge part of what fascinates me about this process. It's a process of deep reading and skillful writing, because you're uncoding, you're unpacking a text, and then you're recoding the text. And you have to do that within guardrails imposed by the possibilities and the limits of language A and language B. Often when you engage in the process, you realize there is no A to B. There is no word that is an exact word. And then beyond that, what a literary translator does is get beyond the meaning of the words. You translate ambiguity, you translate tone, you capture the pleasure in reading that is part of the text. That's what makes the text something that you want to engage with as a reader. You have to bring all of those things and you have to weigh them on the level of the word, the sentence, the paragraph, the book. So it's an act of constant balance. And that's where the creativity and the subjectivity come in. Then that will also be something that we play with in the interactive.
Juliana, one of the things that we reference in the introduction to this roundtable is a recent manifesto on literary translation by PEN America. And they talk about several things. They talk about it from the perspective of the translator, the author whose work is being translated, the publisher who's publishing it, the editors like us who are signing coverage on it. They also try to establish it, as we say, as an art form in its own right. They also talk about how it needs to be sustainable as a livelihood. And there's at least one translator in this roundtable that talks about the issue of fair pay, We don't dig into it too much, but can you shed some light on how that is a pressure point for people that work in this field?
It is indeed. I think historically a lot of translation was done often by academics and people who had other jobs. Now, increasingly, there are MFA programs that put out literary translators, and there are a lot of people who work full-time in this. And the work they do often goes far beyond the actual translation. They act as scouts. They see the literary landscape in 2 countries or more, and they're able to propose pieces that, say, an editor in the United States may not know of. They act as agents. They do sample translations. There's a lot that happens even before they get to the work of translation, and very little of that is paid for. This makes it very hard for people to make a living doing it. And why do we care? Why would a reader care about that? I think it goes to one of the issues that publishing also faces. When there is a significant financial barrier to entry into a field like this, it limits who can work in it. That means the field is self-selecting for a certain kind of person, a person who's independently wealthy, for example, who doesn't need to doesn't need the money that they earn from the job to do the job. And so you're going to get a far less diverse field of translators. And as we were saying, translation is a subjective act. It is a creative act. The translator is imprinted very much on the text. And so when you limit who can do that and who can engage in that act, you are going to get a poorer field necessarily, as you do in any realm. So it's important.
The issue of subjectivity is one that we return to time and again in discussions about translation. Another piece I'm going to mention very quickly in passing is a piece that we commissioned by Daniel Hahn about children's books and about translating children's books. And he talks about one of the most famous children's books of all time in the English language, which is Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. And in his intro to his piece, he takes this one very brief phrase, through night and day and in and out of weeks and almost a year. He's talking about Max going from home to the island where the wild things live. And Daniel writes, quote, over its 60 years, Where the Wild Things Are has been translated into several dozen languages. I've looked at many of the translations, and I have yet to find one that makes that line as interesting as Sendak's. The translators seem to assume that dull simplicity is good enough, that, quote, in and out of weeks is essentially no different than for several weeks, and that, in short, blunt meaning trumps everything else. Greg, you've likely read Where the Wild Things Are many times. I'm sure you're
always in English.
Always in English. I'm sure you remember how beautiful and surprising that phrase is every time you come across it. And it's interesting to focus in on a little segment and use it as an example of how translation is done. We do that in another way in the issue in a piece by Emily Wilson, who's a writer and a translator who recently worked on a forthcoming translation of Homer's The Iliad. And she writes about a section that she translates, but she also puts it next to a translation from 1611 and a translation from 1898. It's a relatively short piece, but I think it's very illuminating. Talk a little bit about it.
Emily Wilson, who is a classics professor at the University of Pennsylvania, had previously translated the Odyssey back in 2017. And she did, so I loved that translation of the Odyssey. It's in a very idiomatic, easy to read, plain language that is very attentive to formal constraints. It's written in iambic pentameter, which is the natural poetic language for English speakers, but Homer, of course, did not use it. So she's translating him from his poetic form into ours and then matching him line for line. Every line of Homer, she turns into an iambic pentameter line of English and does that throughout the Odyssey. She's now done, 6 years later, the same thing with the Iliad, and her version will come out in September. And what she does in this piece for us, there is a line in the roundtable where you referenced it. Somebody says, if you give the same piece to 3 different translators, you'll get 3 different translations. She shows us that in practice. And there have been about 100 translations of the Iliad into English over the past number of centuries since George Chapman first did it in 1611. And she looks at the scene where Hector, the great hero, is bidding goodbye to his wife and baby, and his wife is pleading with him, I know you need to go to war, but you don't need to go to war this way. You don't need to meet the enemy on the open field. You have other options, and you are just marching to your death, and you're banishing me to slavery, and you are condemning, you're going to lose. You're giving up everything you believe in. And he says, look, I have to do what I have to do. This is what the men of Troy do. This is what fate dictates. And she walks us through that scene in particular and how different people have handled it. George Chapman in 1611 wrote in rhyming couplets in 14-syllable lines in the poetic idiom of his day, and in a way that highlighted Hector's stoicism, his I need to do what I need to do, because George Chapman himself was a soldier and a believer in Stoic philosophy, and that was what interested him in that scene. And obviously in translating, you need to bring your own interpretations to things and choose what to highlight and what to leave out, because there are no one-for-one translations. And so what Emily Wilson does so interestingly in this piece is show how the personality of the translator influences what you are reading in the translation and how it changes the reading of the original. You say, oh, I guess that was in the Homer. She does the same thing with Samuel Butler, who did a prose translation, not a poetry translation of the Iliad at all, but did it in prose. His version of Hector's wife, Andromache, is much more beholden to traditional gender roles. She's crying out of fear, which is not in the original, Emily Wilson points out. Hector emphasizes the need for her to stay behind to attend to the household chores, manage the house in a way that it is there in the original, but Butler plays up. And so again, Emily Wilson is showing how the personality of the translator finds its way into the translation itself. And then she concludes with her own translation of that scene. There's an online version of this same piece by Emily Wilson where she looks at a couple of additional translations and unpacks them still further.
Something that you said, Greg, relates to a point that was made again in our roundtable where one of the translators says, the other thing is that the translator as author brings so much personal baggage into the work. We can't translate outside of ourselves. The third piece I want to talk about briefly is very cool piece that is online now. And again, you can find all of these at nytimes.com/books, in which you literally, as you scroll down the article, you can see the translator changing words, trying again, saying, no, this works, this doesn't work. Juliana, could you let us know a little bit about this piece? Who's the person? What are they working on? And how did we alight upon the idea to really focus on the process in this way?
This piece has been fascinating for me to work on. This was a dream of an idea, to be able to go into the head of a translator as they are engaging in the process and see their step-by-step, their trial and error, see this balancing act that we're talking about, that the translation really is between your various allegiances. We're working with Sophie Hughes, known among other things for translating Fernanda Melchor. And the idea came from a talk she gave that I saw a while ago in which she explains to her audience how she goes about fitting the different pieces of the puzzle together and trying to build a coherent whole. And because of this thing that our digital design folks do that to me really looks like magic, they were able to build a machine, essentially. They are able to build an interactive that allows you to watch and engage with her as she tries out the different pieces. And the effect of when she gets something right, you see how it clicks, you see how it resonates in the whole, and then you see how something further down the line clicks and undoes the first part. And you also understand one thing that I think is really interesting right now, why this is not something that AI can do. you can take, as she does in this piece, a piece of a Fernanda Melchor book and put it through Google Translate. And you don't have to be a writer to look at that and see this is not literature. The meaning is conveyed, but this does not work. There is no pleasure in reading this. And by the time you've gone through the process with her and you reach her line of literary translation and you compare the two, you can see what she brings with all of the skill and all of the talent that she has.
Juliana, this has been your first time on the podcast, and you've been fantastic. Thank you for discussing our recent package on literature and translation.
Thank you so much for bringing me on.
And Greg, thank you, as always, for being on here.
Thank you, Gilbert.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm now joined by Liz Egan and Tina Jordan, two editors here. Tina, hello.
Hi there, Gilbert.
Liz, hi.
Hi, Gilbert.
Liz, you were last on the podcast talking about Judy Blume when the film version of Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret was released. Now you're back. You're talking about a piece you've written looking back at the 25th anniversary of Bridget Jones's Diary. What led you to write this piece?
Well, I seem to be a little bit on the nostalgia beat here at the book review, which I do not object to. And I knew that there was a big anniversary coming up for Bridget. Her book was published, Helen Fielding's book, I should say, but Bridget Jones's Diary was published for the first time in the United States 25 years ago this month. And I was curious to reread the book and see if it had the same effect on me that it had those many years ago.
So you went back to it and you loved it, and it's still a great book, and you would recommend it to everyone, right?
I would say the exact opposite.
The exact opposite.
In fact,
okay.
Yes. First of all, I should say that I came into this project with an open heart. I was a big fan of Bridget's. In 1998, she was a couple of years older than I was. And you can tell by the fact that I'm speaking about her as if she's a real person, that I really took her experiences as a young working woman to heart. Even though the book was meant to be funny and she was a really wonderful, she really poked fun at herself in a very clever way. I in some ways modeled myself after her. Like, I just loved her. I loved her way of thinking, her self-deprecating wit, her ability to take every hard thing that happened to her and turn it into a funny story. And I discovered that looking back into her life on the eve of my 50th birthday, she was not as funny to me as she used to be.
Liz, I have a question for
Yes.
you. Sorry, Gilbert. I know you ask the questions here.
Ask away.
Don't you think that there was, behind that humor, there was something very dark? Did you feel that way or not?
I definitely felt that way. And even on this rereading, I saw that darkness, and that was my favorite part. And there's a sense of sincerity and a sense of warmth that I still saw there. Tina, what did you think of Bridget Jones?
The second time around or the first time?
Both.
Well, I loved it the first time around, like you. Bridget was me. I was the first generation of my family to be a single young professional working in an office. I'd had a stay-at-home mom. So I saw a lot of myself in Bridget, and much to my shame now, 25 years later, I accepted the things that happened to me in the same way that Bridget accepted the things that happened to her. It was just like the price of being in the working world. And I think the second time around, both you and I were horrified, especially at the rampant sexism in both of her workplaces, for example.
And the rampant hatred of her own body, which is something many of us were raised with.
Right.
That has taken decades to undo, which our daughters are constantly reminding us of. My daughters who are Gen Z, I guess, are always pointing out my Gen X qualities and funny hang-ups about food. And it was difficult to read about that in Bridget Jones's diary and to see how this counting of fat grams and weighing yourself every day, to be reminded she wrote it in a humorous way, but that was a big part of the world back then.
Right. It was a huge part of the world back then. And I think we look at her now and we say the fat phobia makes it actually very difficult to reread the book, right?
Yes.
But it is like what it was like for us. And over again in the book, Bridget's mother, who we get a lot of comic relief from, is always listing the reasons that Bridget's never going to find a man.
Yes.
And what's number one on the list? It's her body. And her mother calls and says things like, I'm going to come take you for lunch. No, I'll just bring a piece of skinless salmon to your apartment or whatever.
Sounds
right?
healthy.
Yeah.
You're giving me a withering look right now, is what you're doing. Now, let me ask a question about revisiting this book, because it relates to something Tina just said, which is, if that was the way it was, as we like to say about the past, when the past was worse than it is now, is this not just a reflection of that time, as opposed to a book that we should say, this is no good anymore?
I would actually say the former. It is a reflection of the time. If you go into it knowing that, you might have a good reading experience. I'm not in the business of canceling books, or I'm not in the business of canceling Bridget Jones's diary. There's too much in it that is funny and is true, but you should go into it aware that you will be faced with so much sexism and so much fat phobia. It's a painful read in places. And I ask the question in the essay that I wrote about Bridget Jones, if you have a daughter who is about to enter the workforce, as I do in 1 week, is this the book that I would want her to read right now? And the answer to that question is a resounding no.
But why is that? Why would you not want her to see what it was like?
First of all, she's already seen the movies like 10 times.
All right.
I feel like there are so many good books in the world that I'm trying to force her to read at any given time. Why would I want her to read this one?
Take us back, Liz or Tina, to what the publishing scene was like. What was the environment into which this book was published? What else were people reading? And then what influence did this have on books that came out after it?
For me personally, this book was so appealing because it felt like it was for us, like for the women who sat around me in the assistants bullpen at the magazine where I worked. Although I will say that my boss at that time, who was a very early mentor, was not a fan of Bridget Jones and called out the things that we're talking about now, 25 years ago. But it felt like a book that was geared towards our phase of life. And the book just had this tidal wave of publicity and support. And then it led to an entire genre of books that I won't call copycats, but that were descendants of Bridget Jones. And those were the Shopaholic books, the Nanny Diaries, I Don't Know How She Does It by Allison Pearson. I myself, 10 years ago, wrote a novel that was unfavorably compared to Bridget Jones. So maybe I have a chip on my shoulder that I wasn't deemed as funny as Bridget. But in the years that followed, there were so many books that could be traced, that had a humor that could be traced back to Bridget. And it wasn't until very recently that the books that we were getting pitched here at the New York Times, until recently, many of them came with letters that said, this is Bridget Jones for the new century. And I think people have let go of that. But there were hundreds of galley letters that were worded that way. Do you remember, Tina?
I do remember. And I want to pick up on something you said, and it's the humor, because this is a really funny book. That is the other thing that came back to me when I reread it. I actually laughed out loud. And as you well know, I am not a laugh out loud while reading kind of person. But the one-liners, the comparisons, like it really is funny.
It is funny. It is. And I don't want to come across as the big grouch.
Too late. Too late.
It is really, it is funny.
I'm going to give you one of my favorite lines, which I actually wrote down last night. Being a woman is worse than being a farmer. There's so much harvesting and crop spraying to be done. And she's referring to having to shave her legs and pluck her eyebrows. But I laughed out loud.
Of course, I laughed out loud too. But then there are other lines like, here's one that did not age well.
Each of you came with receipts.
I did. She's talking about her, this is a bit of a spoiler, but she does have an affair with her boss. And she's worried because she hasn't heard, a few days have gone by where she hasn't heard from him. And this is after he sends her an email that says, Jones, I like your tits in that top. Okay, so this is Bridget. He will clearly by now have got off with a thin American cool person called Winona who puts out, carries a gun, and is everything I am not. I'm just saying that doesn't age well.
No, but I think it doesn't age well. I think it's the boss, Daniel, who especially doesn't age well.
He does not age well.
No.
And for those who have not read the book, Daniel is the person in the movie who's played by Hugh Grant. And one thing about the movie versions of the Bridget Jones books, it's very hard to reread the book without seeing Renee Zellweger and Hugh Grant's faces when you picture these characters. Because this is an instance where I think the movies supplanted the book. Do you agree?
I agree.
One thing I wanted to ask briefly about was we're also celebrating the 25th anniversary of one of the great shows of its time, Sex and the City, which is now entering its second season under a different name. And just like that, can you talk about these two side by side? Because I feel like they both, in a way, are touching on what it was like to be, England, America, what it was like to be a young professional woman.
I think for starters, the obvious comparison is Bridget and Carrie, two chain-smoking career women with a dependable band of chums. That part is huge.
And to me, the central difference is that Carrie took herself a lot more seriously than Bridget. And so when you look at Carrie through a modern lens, yes, she makes some bad decisions, but she also recognizes her own intelligence and her own place in the world and asks for what she deserves. And what's frustrating to me about Bridget is time and again in this book, she doesn't. And eventually she does. But there was this fascination at that time with the young career woman. And my theory is that it's because we, the women of that, who were that age at that time, were supposed to be the beneficiaries of all of this work that our mothers and our grandmothers, and as I said in my piece, our women's studies professors, all the work that they had done to make sure that we were equals when we entered the world and the workforce. And another thing that was frustrating to me looking back on this book was the realization that we no longer assume those things. And we realized that a lot of that progress that we thought had been made, that we were raised to believe was our birthright, has been undone.
What do you mean by that? Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, we've just lived through the Me Too movement, which is ongoing, and we've seen the extent to which women were hurt and careers were derailed by sexist bosses and a sexist system. Roe v. Wade has been overturned. That was passed the year I was born. It never occurred to so many of us that it was seriously in jeopardy. So many of these pillars of, or really so many of the foundations of feminism have been rocked in the past 8 or 9 years. And it made me sad to read this book and remember a time when we took so much of it for granted. Did you feel that way, Tina?
I did. And I think like I have daughters like you do, and so there's this big piece of me that's looking at everything that's being undone that I thought for sure was granted to my daughters, even though it hadn't been granted to us.
Exactly. And now I also felt reading this book that while I was counting fat grams, I should have been marching in the streets and making sure that none of these things would be overturned or undone, and speaking up at work from day one. If you see something, say something. So many of us didn't say anything, and I regret that.
Or we did say something and were shot down.
Exactly.
It feels very awkward to tell you both to stop talking, but we do need to bring this conversation to an end. But I would encourage all of our listeners to find and read and reflect and leave comments on Liz Egan's essay on the 25th anniversary of Bridget Jones's Diary. Liz, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you, Gilbert.
Tina, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Those were my conversations about Bridget Jones's Diary at 25 and the state of literature in translation. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.